Picture this. You're 23 years old, responsible for 4,000 head of ornery Texas Longhorns, 17 hungry cowboys who haven't seen a hot meal in days, and you're trapped on a windswept ridge in Wyoming territory, while Mother Nature throws everything she's got at you. That's exactly where Jake Morrison found himself, in November of 1847, and folks, this is where our story begins. Now, Jake wasn't supposed to be trail boss. That honor belonged to his father, Samuel Morrison, a man who'd driven cattle from Texas to Montana more times than most people had eaten hot dinners. But cholera has a way of changing plans, doesn't it? Samuel died that summer, leaving Jake with the biggest responsibility of his young life and a drive schedule that couldn't wait for grief. The Wyoming Territory winter of 1847 arrived like an unwelcome guest who shows up 3 weeks early to the party. One day, Jake's looking at clear skies and thinking he'll make Cheyenne before the first snow. The next morning, he's staring at clouds so dark they looked like they'd been dipped in charcoal, and the wind's picking up in a way that makes experienced cowboys start checking their gear twice. But here's where things get interesting. And this is something that would have seemed impossible to anyone who understood frontier preservation at the time. Jake had done everything right. He'd followed his father's methods to the letter. The beef had been properly salted, using the traditional techniques passed down through generations of cattlemen. They'd smoked it according to the old ways, the methods that had kept cowboys alive on long drives since before Jake was born. And it all went wrong. You see, that autumn had been different. Unusually warm, unusually humid. The kind of weather that makes meat preservation a nightmare even when you think you know what you're doing. Jake watched, day by day, as their carefully preserved food supplies turned green, despite the salt. The smoking methods that should have worked? They failed in that humid air like a campfire in a thunderstorm. Think about what that means for a moment. You're responsible for 18 lives, counting yourself. You're trapped by weather that could kill you all, and your food is literally rotting before your eyes. Jake calculated they had maybe 10 days before desperation would force him to start slaughtering the cattle they were driving to market. 10 days before, he'd have to watch his family's future disappear one head at a time. Now, Devil's Ridge got its name for good reason. It's a stretch of rocky terrain that offers shelter if you know where to look, but it's also the kind of place where a wrong step in a blizzard can send you tumbling into a canyon you never saw coming. On the fourth night of what the cowboys were already calling the worst storm they'd ever seen, Jake was searching for firewood when he discovered he wasn't the only one seeking shelter on that God-forsaken ridge. White Crow was 60 years old, a Lakota elder who'd seen more winters than Jake had seen summers. Under normal circumstances, this meeting might have gone very differently. The frontier in 1847 wasn't exactly known for peaceful encounters between white cattlemen and Native Americans. But exhaustion has a way of stripping away pretense, doesn't it? When you're cold, hungry, and facing death, survival trumps everything else. Instead of conflict, they found conversation. Maybe it was the shared misery of the storm, maybe it was the recognition that they were both a long way from home and facing the same deadly weather. Whatever it was, Jake found himself sitting across a small fire from a man who represented everything he'd been taught to fear, and discovering that fear makes poor company when you're trying not to freeze to death. White Crow had been traveling alone, which should tell you something about his capabilities. 60 years old, moving, through a blizzard that had trapped a full cattle outfit, and he seemed— comfortable isn't the right word, but prepared. Resigned. Maybe. Like he'd made peace with whatever the weather wanted to throw at him. When Jake mentioned their food situation, something shifted in the old man's expression. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. You see, White Crow knew something that Jake didn't. He knew the buffalo herds were disappearing. He'd seen the writing on the wall that his people's traditional way of life was ending, and he understood that survival meant adaptation. What happened next would change both their lives, and arguably, the entire course of Western expansion. White Crow began to speak of the old ways, not in the mystical, spiritual sense that Eastern newspapers loved to romanticize, but in practical terms that would have impressed any scientist. He talked about how his people preserved buffalo meat that could last 3 winters. Not 3 months, not 1 winter, but 3. full winters. Meat that retained not just edibility, but actual nutritional value across years of storage. The technique involved prairie sage, white cedar bark, and wild juniper berries. But it wasn't just about the ingredients. It was about understanding wind direction, moon phases, temperature control, and smoking methods that required knowledge passed down through generations. This wasn't folk wisdom or primitive superstition. This was sophisticated food science developed over centuries by people whose survival depended on getting it exactly right. Jake offered White Crow 30 head of cattle for his band in exchange for detailed instruction. 30 head represented real money, enough to make a difference in anyone's winter preparations. But more than that, it represented something unprecedented, a business partnership between two worlds that were supposedly at war. White Crow accepted, and that decision, made in a cave on Devil's Ridge during the worst blizzard Wyoming territory had seen in a generation, was about to transform everything we thought we knew about how the American West was really won. View the complete first chapter, https claude.ai/chat/f3fd0a7c-7b7f-4ada-b8bb-85017 Bayfeb D2. Would you like me to continue to the next chapter? What Jake Morrison learned over the next few months would make modern food scientists weep with envy. You see, we like to think of preservation as something that happened accidentally until refrigeration came along. We imagine primitive people stumbling around, hoping their meat wouldn't kill them. But what White Crow taught Jake during that brutal winter was anything but primitive. It was sophisticated chemistry disguised as ceremony, and it worked better than anything the industrial world had yet invented. The first lesson came at dawn after their initial agreement. White Crow led Jake through knee-deep snow to a stand of juniper trees, their berries still clinging to branches despite the storm. But he didn't just point and say, "Pick those." Instead, he spent 2 hours teaching Jake to identify 13 different prairie plants by taste and smell. Not because Jake needed to know all 13, but because White Crow understood something that would take Western science another 50 years to figure out. Preservation isn't just about one ingredient. It's about understanding an entire ecosystem. Think about this for a moment. White Crow could taste a juniper berry and tell you not just whether it was ripe, but whether the tree it came from had grown in alkaline soil or acidic soil, whether it had been stressed by drought, whether it would provide the right chemical compounds for long-term meat preservation. This wasn't mysticism. This was a man who'd spent 60 years learning to read the chemistry of the natural world. The juniper berries had to be crushed with white salt from the Bonneville Flats. Not just any salt, mind you. The Bonneville salt contained specific mineral traces that acted as natural preservatives. Jake learned to mix these in precise ratios that White Crow measured not with scales, but with the palm of his hand. After 6 decades of practice, the old man's palm had become a more accurate measuring device than anything Jake had ever seen. But the real magic happened with the prairie sage. This had to be harvested before first frost, when the plant's natural oils were at their peak concentration. White Crow taught Jake to identify sage that had grown in different soil conditions, because each variety contributed different preservative properties. The sage from clay soil provided moisture control. The sage from sandy soil contributed antimicrobial compounds. The sage from rocky outcroppings offered something White Crow called the bitter that keeps, which Jake would later learn was a natural antioxidant more powerful than anything in a modern chemistry lab. Then came the smoking technique, and this is where things got truly remarkable. White Crow showed Jake how to read smoke patterns like a sailor reads wind. The temperature had to be hot enough to seal the meat's surface, but cool enough to preserve the nutrients inside. Too hot, and you'd create a hard shell that trapped moisture and led to rot. Too cool, and you'd never penetrate deep enough to prevent spoilage. The smoke blend itself was an art form. Cedar provided the base heat and the primary preservative compounds. Cottonwood added a sweetness that masked the bitter taste of long preservation. Buffalo grass contributed oils that penetrated deep into the meat fibers. But the ratios changed depending on wind direction, humidity, even the phase of the moon. Now, before you roll your eyes at that last part, Consider this. The moon's phase correlates directly with atmospheric pressure, which affects how deeply smoke penetrates organic matter. White Crow didn't understand the physics, but he understood the results. Meat treated during a waning moon lasted longer, and he'd observed this pattern for decades. Jake's first successful batch was ready by late February. The meat not only lasted through spring, it maintained actual flavor. Not just edibility, not just nutrition, but taste that made you want to eat it, rather than simply survive on it. When the spring thaw finally came, and they drove the surviving cattle to market, Jake carried samples of preserved meat that were indistinguishable from fresh beef, except for a subtle smoky flavor that made them somehow better than the original. Word spread through the Cowboy network faster than wildfire, and if you understand how information traveled among working cowboys in 1848, you know that's saying something. These men rode circuits that covered thousands of miles. They gathered at watering holes, trading posts, and winter camps from Texas to Montana. By summer, riders were coming from as far as El Paso and Billings, offering gold, horses, and land rights for Jake's knowledge. But here's where Jake Morrison showed the kind of strategic thinking that separated him from every other frontier entrepreneur of his time. He shared the knowledge freely with working cowboys but charged wealthy ranchers. The cowboys he saw as brothers in hardship. The wealthy ranchers? They were businessmen who could afford to pay for valuable information. This decision created something unprecedented on the American frontier. A knowledge network that favored working people over established wealth. Jake used the profits from wealthy ranchers to establish preservation camps along major cattle routes. Small operations, usually run by experienced cowboys who'd learned his techniques, that could process meat for anyone who needed it. The real breakthrough came when Jake formed an alliance with Mexican vaqueros, working the southern routes. These men brought their own techniques involving chile peppers and mesquite wood that complemented White Crow's methods perfectly. The chile peppers provided additional antimicrobial properties, while mesquite smoke penetrated meat more efficiently than any wood Jake had previously used. The hybrid method they developed was revolutionary. It could preserve meat for up to 3 years while actually improving its flavor over time. But more importantly, it could be taught to anyone willing to learn. You didn't need expensive equipment or rare ingredients. Everything you needed grew wild on the prairie or could be traded for easily. By 1849, Jake's preservation technique was enabling cattle drives that had been impossible before. Cowboys could carry enough preserved meat to survive longer routes, opening up new markets and making previously unprofitable drives economically viable. The technique was democratizing the cattle industry, giving small operators the same advantages that had previously belonged only to large outfits with extensive supply networks. But this success attracted dangerous attention. The established meat wholesalers in Chicago and Kansas City had built their fortunes on controlling beef distribution. They owned the railroads, the packing plants, the distribution networks, and suddenly they were facing competition from cowboys who could preserve their own meat and sell it directly to customers. The National Meat Trust wasn't about to let some frontier cowboy destroy their monopoly, and Jake Morrison was about to learn that knowledge, no matter how valuable, means nothing if powerful people want you dead. The preservation wars were about to begin. By 1850, Jake Morrison commanded something that had never existed before in American history: an informal network of over 300 preservation specialists scattered across the frontier. This wasn't a business in any conventional sense. It was something closer to a guild, or maybe a secret society, bound together not by formal contracts, but by shared knowledge and mutual benefit. Think about what this meant, in practical terms. Every major cattle route from Texas to Montana now had preservation stations where cowboys could process their meat or trade for already preserved supplies. These weren't grand establishments. Most were simple operations run by 1 or 2 experienced hands who'd learned Jake's techniques and sworn an oath against monopolistic practices. But together, they represented economic independence for thousands of frontier families. Jake's method had evolved far beyond what White Crow had taught him in that cave. Working with vaqueros, native tribes, and immigrant farmers from across Europe, Jake had developed a sophisticated system where different recipes served different purposes. There was the quick cure for immediate consumption, designed to turn fresh beef into preserved meat within 48 hours. There was the 6-month storage recipe for seasonal planning. And then there was the legendary 3-winter cure, reserved for emergency supplies and special occasions. The 3-winter cure was something to behold. Meat treated with this method could last 3 full years, while actually improving in flavor and nutritional value over time. The process took 6 weeks and required materials from across the continent: white salt from the Bonneville Flats, juniper berries from the high desert, prairie sage from the Great Plains, mesquite wood from Texas, and chili peppers from New Mexico. But the result was meat that tasted better after 2 years than most fresh beef tasted on the day it was slaughtered. Jake formalized his network by establishing the Free Range Preservation Society. Any cowboy could join by swearing a simple oath to share the knowledge freely with working people, to charge fair prices for services, and to resist any attempts at monopolization by outside interests. The oath was administered at preservation camps across the frontier, usually around a campfire after a day's work, with the smell of curing meat in the air and the sound of cattle settling for the night. The society's influence spread in ways that surprised even Jake. Preservation stations became unofficial banks, where preserved meat served as currency more stable than gold in many frontier towns. A pound of 3-winter cured beef had known value anywhere from El Paso to Billings. You could trade it for supplies, pay debts, or use it as collateral for loans. In some towns, preserved meat prices became the standard against which all other goods were measured. This economic impact rippled across Western development in unexpected ways. Towns sprouted around preservation stations, sustained by the economic activity they generated. The stations needed workers, suppliers, and support services. They attracted merchants, craftsmen, and farmers. What had started as simple meat processing operations became the economic engines that powered frontier communities. Consider the Butterfly Ranch in Colorado, run by Jake's protégé Maria Santos. Maria had been a camp cook on cattle drives until she learned Jake's preservation methods and used them to establish the first operation owned entirely by a woman on the Colorado frontier. The preserved meat profits gave her economic independence that would have been impossible through any other frontier profession. By 1851, the Butterfly Ranch employed 12 people and supplied preserved meat to mining camps throughout the Colorado Territory. Native tribes, initially skeptical of any dealings with white settlers, began to see opportunities in Jake's network. Tribes that had traditional preservation knowledge found themselves in demand as consultants and partners. The Crow taught techniques for preserving fish. The Cheyenne contributed methods for processing buffalo that could be adapted to cattle. The Apache shared knowledge of desert plants that enhanced preservation in hot climates. These partnerships created hybrid techniques that surpassed even Jake's original methods. A Lakota-Mexican fusion technique developed near Santa Fe could preserve meat in desert conditions that would have ruined any previous method. A Crow-Irish collaboration in Montana produced preserved meat that remained fresh during river crossings and high-altitude transport. But perhaps the most significant development was the democratization of the cattle industry itself. Before Jake's preservation network, small operators faced enormous disadvantages. They couldn't afford the supply chains, transportation networks, and storage facilities that large outfits took for granted. A small rancher might raise excellent cattle but lose money because he couldn't get his beef to market in good condition. Jake's network changed everything. A small operator could now preserve his meat locally, transport it efficiently, and sell it directly to customers without depending on the distribution monopolies controlled by Eastern interests. By 1852, an estimated 40,000 settlers relied on Jake's network for survival, making him arguably the most influential figure in Western expansion, though few history books would ever record his name. The preserved meat trade created new opportunities for everyone involved. Cowboys could earn winter wages at preservation stations instead of facing unemployment during the off-season. Farmers could sell prairie, sage, cedar bark, and other materials to the preservation network. Merchants found new products to trade. Even school teachers and preachers benefited, as preservation stations often became community centers that needed educated people to keep records and conduct business. Jake himself had evolved from a desperate young trail boss into something approaching a frontier statesman. He traveled constantly, visiting preservation stations, teaching new techniques, and mediating disputes within the network. He carried no weapons and traveled with minimal escort, relying on the respect and protection of the society members, scattered across his territory. But Jake's democratic vision faced a growing threat. The National Meat Trust, representing the consolidated interests of Chicago and Kansas City wholesalers, had identified the Free-Range Preservation Society as a direct threat to their profits. They controlled the railroads, the major packing plants, and the distribution networks that had made them wealthy, and they weren't about to let some frontier cowboy destroy their monopoly. The Trust's first attempts at suppression were economic. They offered to buy out preservation stations at inflated prices, hoping to collapse the network through financial incentives. When that failed, they tried to corner the market on salt and other essential materials. When that proved impossible, given the vast distances and multiple supply sources involved, they turned to more direct methods. Industrial espionage agents began appearing at preservation stations, claiming to be traveling cowboys while actually gathering intelligence on Jake's techniques and network structure. Mysterious fires started consuming preservation camps, always during the night when no one could identify the perpetrators. Cowboys loyal to Jake began disappearing, found days later beaten and warned to find new employment. Jake knew the escalation was deliberate. The Trust was testing his network's resilience, probing for weaknesses, preparing for a more serious assault. The question wasn't whether they would try to destroy him, but when and how. The answer came on Christmas Eve, 1854, when 3 hired guns waited for Jake outside the church in Cheyenne, Wyoming territory. But Jake Morrison had survived too much to die easily, and the Free-Range Preservation Society had grown too large to be stopped by killing one man. The preservation wars were about to teach the National Meat Trust that some ideas are bigger than the people who create them. The 3 hired guns waiting for Jake Morrison outside the Methodist Church in Cheyenne on Christmas Eve, 1854, made one critical mistake. They underestimated how many friends a man makes when he's spent 7 years keeping people alive on the frontier. Jake survived the assassination attempt, but barely. 2 bullets found their mark before members of the Free-Range Preservation Society, attending the same Christmas service, intervened with the kind of frontier justice that settled disputes quickly and permanently. Jake spent 3 months recovering from his wounds. 3 months that gave him plenty of time to think about what the National Meat Trust's escalation really meant. The message was clear. The Trust wasn't interested in competition or negotiation. They wanted total control, and they were willing to kill for it. Jake realized his democratic vision faced organized opposition with resources he couldn't match. The Trust controlled railroads, banks, and political connections from Chicago to Washington. They could buy judges, hire armies, and manipulate markets with a sophistication that no frontier network could counter. But Jake Morrison had learned something during his years working with White Crow and the diverse communities that made up his preservation network. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is make sure your knowledge survives, even if you don't. He made a strategic decision that would prove more important than any of his previous innovations. Instead of trying to fight the Trust directly, Jake decided to document everything. Every technique, every recipe, every hard-learned lesson about preservation, distribution, and frontier economics. He would create a record that could survive any attempt at suppression. Working with William Bent, a former cavalry officer turned artist who joined the preservation network after leaving the military, Jake began compiling what they called the Prairie Preservation Manual. This wasn't just a cookbook or a technical guide. It was a comprehensive record of everything Jake had learned about building economic independence on the American frontier. The manual included detailed illustrations of every plant used in preservation, with notes on identification, harvesting times, and regional variations. It documented the smoking techniques developed by different communities, the chemistry behind successful preservation, and the business methods that had made the Free-Range Preservation Society successful. Most importantly, it explained the philosophy behind Jake's approach, that knowledge belonged to working people, not wealthy monopolists. William Bent's illustrations were works of art that doubled as technical documentation. His drawing of the three-winter curing process showed not just the steps involved, but the subtle visual cues that determined success or failure. His maps documented preservation station locations, supply routes, and the network connections that made the whole system function. Jake and William worked through the winter of 1854 and into the spring of 1855, racing against time and the Trust's increasing harassment. They knew that once the manual was complete, Jake would become an even bigger target. But they also knew that 500 copies distributed throughout the frontier would be impossible to suppress entirely. The manual's distribution was a masterpiece of frontier logistics. Jake used his preservation network to smuggle copies to remote locations where they could be hidden and preserved. Copies went to isolated ranches, native settlements, Mexican villages, and mining camps across the West. Each copy came with instructions to make additional copies if possible, ensuring the knowledge would spread faster than any industrial agents could track. By autumn 1855, Jake estimated that over 2,000 people had access to the complete preservation techniques. The knowledge had become too widespread to control, too valuable to suppress, and too useful to forget. The Trust's response was predictably vicious. They launched a coordinated campaign to destroy preservation stations, buying out local officials and using their railroad connections to control supply chains. Preservation camps were raided by hired guns, claiming to represent federal marshals. Cowboys loyal to Jake were blacklisted from employment with major cattle operations, but the Trust had fundamentally misunderstood what they were fighting. This wasn't a business they could buy out or a competitor they could intimidate. It was an idea that had taken root in thousands of minds across the frontier. Every person who'd learned Jake's techniques became a potential teacher. Every family that had survived a hard winter on preserved meat became an advocate for the methods that had saved them. Jake spent his final years on a small ranch near Devil's Ridge, where it all began. He was only 31 when the assassination attempt ended his traveling days, but the injuries had aged him beyond his years. He walked with a limp, tired easily, and could no longer handle the physical demands of long-distance travel. But retirement suited him in ways that surprised everyone who knew him. Jake discovered he loved teaching. Cowboys, settlers, immigrants, and Native Americans made pilgrimages to his ranch to learn preservation techniques directly from the man who'd pioneered them. Jake taught anyone who asked, charging nothing for his time and asking only that his students pass the knowledge along to others. His ranch became something between a school and a shrine. People came not just to learn preservation techniques, but to understand the philosophy behind Jake's approach to frontier economics. He taught that knowledge was power, but only if it was shared rather than hoarded. He explained that economic independence required cooperation, not just competition. He demonstrated that traditional enemies could become valuable allies when they faced common problems. The industrial meatpacking plants eventually dominated the market, just as the Trust had planned. Railroads, refrigeration, and mass production techniques made Jake's preservation methods seem quaint and old-fashioned. By 1870, most preserved meat sold in American cities came from industrial facilities in Chicago and Kansas City. But Jake's methods survived in family traditions, ranch operations, and small-town smokehouses throughout the West. German immigrants adapted his techniques for making sausages. Mexican families used his principles to improve their traditional jerky recipes. Native tribes incorporated his innovations into their own preservation methods. Irish settlers combined his smoking techniques with their own knowledge of salt curing. When Jake Morrison died in 1881 at age 57, his funeral attracted over 2,000 people from across the frontier. Cowboys, farmers, merchants, Native Americans, and immigrants gathered to honor a man who'd given them the knowledge to survive and prosper in a harsh land. His grave marker was simple: Jake Morrison, 1824 to 1881. He taught us to preserve what matters. But his real monument was the thousands of people who continued using his techniques long after his death. Today, artisan meat curers unknowingly use methods descended from Jake Morrison's desperate winter innovation. Food historians debate whether one man's discovery really enabled the settlement of the American West, or if larger forces would have prevailed regardless of any individual contribution. What remains undebatable is that for 3 crucial decades, Jake Morrison's preserved meat fed the dreams and bodies of those who built the frontier. He proved that knowledge shared becomes power multiplied, that traditional enemies can become valuable allies, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns, but with recipes, passed around campfires under starlit skies. The American West was won by many things: railroads, telegraphs, military force, and federal policy. But it was also won by a young cowboy who learned the chemistry of survival from a Lakota elder during the worst blizzard Wyoming Territory had ever seen, and who understood that the best way to fight a monopoly is to make sure everyone knows what the monopolists are trying to hide. In the end, Jake Morrison's greatest innovation wasn't a preservation technique. It was the idea that knowledge belongs to the people who need it most, and that the best way to preserve anything valuable is to teach others how to create it for themselves. That's a lesson worth preserving,